that effect. And what we're starting to see now is more and more the study of games as cultural artifacts. This is the website for DIGRA. DIGRA is a Digital Game Research Association, primarily here in Europe. But it's a global organization where it exists to study games, to sort of explore games as cultural artifacts, to explore games from their socioeconomic perspective, from the psychological aspect, the sort of soft science, humanities part of things. But really, a bunch of super smart people that are studying games the same way that you would have similar groups studying film or studying, I don't know, or sculpture or other forms of art. And they've been around for a few years, but you're starting to see that more and more in the game space, more so than in the past. Well, actually, I was going to test you who this was, but Marco showed who he was this morning. That's Warren Spector. But I'm guessing absolutely nobody knows who this guy is. Nobody does, no. His name is Jesper Juul. He's from Denmark, and he's one of the first game doctors. He's a PhD in, I don't know the exact sort of degree, but game studies, let's call it. And this is from a few years ago, and certainly there are more game doctors out there now. But what's interesting is that we're starting to see this sort of breed of academic that are studying games not because they want to get a job in the industry, but because they're academics and they want interesting things to study and explore, and they have no intent of then working in the industry. It's just, they're nerdy academics, and that's what they do, and they sort of pick games as their sort of artifact of choice. I mean, in Jesper's case, actually, he's sort of a combo. He's a bit of a Renaissance guy where he'll actually design games as part of the studying process. And then, of course, this sort of leads us to efforts to preserve the history of games and some of the museum efforts that are going on. This is a picture from the Strong Museum of Play in New York, where they have the International Center for the History of Electronic Games, and they have a huge archive of old and new stuff. Of course, here they're holding the Atari 2600, and they have newer stuff like Guitar Hero and so on. And they very recently launched an exposition called E-Game Revolutions, where they really kind of look at the arc of the creation of games, down to modern day stuff. And we're seeing these kind of efforts, popping up all over the place, usually within larger, either media museums or humanities-oriented archives. This is just a very quick screen from a picture from the Video Game Museum in Paris. There's also one that the UK National Archives is doing, and there's some in Asia and elsewhere. Germany also has one as part of their technology museum. It was recently announced that the Smithsonian was also going to do a temporary exhibit on the history of video games. But of course, the Smithsonian being one of the most significant, museums in the world. And I don't know if the Louvre is doing anything. That would be interesting. They were doing something. Another one is at Stanford. This is, there's Warren again. This is Henry Lowood. He's an academic at Stanford, and really one of the pioneers in game history, game preservation, and so on. And I don't know if anyone knows, this is Italian Matteo Bettanti, who does work with IOMI, although I think he's over in the US now. At Stanford, they have an archive. They're working on similar sort of preservation efforts. But it's particularly interesting. Henry's the chair of the IGDA's Game Preservation Special Interest Group, and really talks about the need to preserve our history, the need to understand the game culture and gamer culture, and looks at games from an art perspective, from a cultural perspective, the fact that games make statements, and also that games and the history of games say a lot about us as humans. When half of the in the U.S. Half of the country are game players. If the other half probably don't admit that they are, but it says something about ourselves, the types of games that we play, the types of games that we create. And unlike, a cultural artifact like, for example, the, sculptures or paintings, or even something like the Colosseum, that while it's deteriorating, you need to care for them. Games don't have that permanence, right? It's bits, it's ones and zeros, and someone has to take the time and effort to preserve those, to recognize their importance, and preserve that history. And luckily, for us here in Italy, we have that, right? We're creating, as Marco hinted to, Vigamus, which is a museum project. It's our attempt to preserve that history, to recognize the significance of game culture, and it is going to be a standalone museum. Unlike most of the other ones, which are embedded within larger archives. There will be a permanent exhibit which talks about the history of games, but there'll also be a temporary element or rotating exhibit that allows us to explore maybe more contemporary aspects or issues in games. But importantly, it's not just going to be a museum. It's also going to be a center for games culture and games research. A lot of the stuff that I mentioned that Henry Lowood was working on, or DIGRA, the type of research that they do, this center will promote that. Also, it will become a place to incubate new startups and independent developers to explore some of those quadrants the mainstream industry wasn't exploring, to sort of support, in some ways, the games that are in the other bubbles, on that ecosystem graph, and also there'll be training and courses that'll be available.